First, examine the goals of carrying out a literature review, and we're going to do so by considering basic and applied research separately. Basic research, as you may recall, involves carrying out research in order to find out something new so that you can contribute to the expansion of knowledge within an academic field. When carrying out and writing a literature review for a basic research project, your goal should be to first and foremost get to grips with and describe and critique the theoretical frameworks and concepts that are relevant to a particular field of study. You should also be focusing on empirical research findings and also describing and critiquing methodological and analytic approaches that are commonly used within that field of research. So there's a lot to cover in terms of foundational information about the research field, and then on top of that, your goal needs to be highlighting salient gaps in knowledge, particularly those that you yourself are hoping to fill, and the literature that you review should, in essence, help to frame your research question, providing the necessary foundational knowledge needed by the researcher to understand your topic and the context that is needed for them to understand why you're asking the question in the first place. In applied research, the goals of the lit review are more or less the same, but with a slightly different emphasis. Remember that in applied research, you are trying to understand or solve a problem that is affecting an organization, a business, or maybe even society at large. When you review the literature, you are doing so in order to try and understand and diagnose the problem that you're interested in, and essentially you want to reformulate that problem by grounding it in theory. While you might have started out by framing the problem in a particular way based on your practical and professional experience of the issue, it is important when doing applied research to reframe and reformulate the problem in a more academic term. Identifying relevant theories and concepts can help you to think about the problem differently. In particular, it helps you to phrase the problem in terms of key variables that might be involved, and it helps you to also identify key variables that might play a causal role in this problem, and it may even help you to put forward solutions that you might wish to investigate. Moving on now to the structure of the literature review, and although there are no hard and fast rules about how you must structure or write a lit review, there are certain overarching organisational principles that we can follow. For instance, the lit review should always start off fairly broad. You should introduce your reader to key concepts and provide any relevant context. You should assume that your reader knows little or nothing about your topic and therefore ease them into it by giving them foundational knowledge and also by providing information to contextualise the research project. Next, you will want to outline very clearly the scope of your review. It is often said that in academic writing, you should follow the principle of telling your reader what you are going to say before you say it. This is a very simple principle, and it helps a great deal in terms of providing your reader with a roadmap of what is to come. The reader has very different values to what you might have in writing a lit review. They value clarity, simplicity, and coherence, and so by telling them what you're going to say before you say it, you can really help them out in terms of being able to pay attention to the content of your lit review and also giving them some expectation of what they can expect to learn about. Next, we have the main body of the literature review, and this is where the format can vary greatly from one person to the next. In a moment, we will talk about some of the organisational principles that you can keep in mind when writing the main body of the lit review. Finally, what you should be building towards is a summary section in which you can draw together key points in a way that helps to get across the problem statement and provides the necessary framing for your research aims, objectives, and research questions. Now to talk more specifically about the organisational principles that can be applied to the main body of your literature review. There are many different ways of organising the contents of the main body. For instance, you can take a thematic approach, whereby you break the main body down into headings and subheadings that represent themes and subthemes. This is a really popular approach and one that is very well suited to a dissertation. Another option is to organise your main body into different sections that reflect key issues, debates, or controversies within your area of study. Another possibility is to organise the contents chronologically, tracing the development of a particular field of study over time, starting with older theories and culminating in the most contemporary issues. Another organisational strategy that can be applied is to organise ideas according to different prominent authors, which is a lot like organising according to different perspectives, as different authors may be proponents of slightly different viewpoints. A further way of organising the main body of the lit review is to do so in terms of methodologies. That is, grouping together studies that have been conducted using similar methodological approaches and therefore offer similar types of insights. Finally, and perhaps more commonly, you could take a hybrid approach, which is probably the best way of characterising the format of most reviews. There may be an overarching organisational structure, such as a thematic structure, but within that subsections or paragraphs within subsections may be organised according to some of these other principles. The next thing to consider are some guidelines on how to write the literature review effectively. In other words, how are you going to ensure that it is first and foremost informative, meaning that the reader gets a good understanding of the key concepts and theoretical framework for your study, as well as relevant empirical evidence? Well, firstly, you need to ensure that your writing is clear so that the reader is able to follow and understand what you are trying to say. Here we are going to look at 4 key guidelines that you should follow in order to ensure that your writing is clear. The first thing to consider is length, and this applies to written work in a variety of ways. First of all, it is a good idea to write sentences that are short in length, because longer sentences can become a mouthful to read, they can be too complex, they can contain redundancy, and can ultimately confuse people. They are also more likely to contain grammatical errors. Length is also a consideration when writing a paragraph. Paragraphs should not be too short. They should contain at least 3 sentences, but ideally no more than 7. Another way to put this is to say the paragraph should be somewhere between 100 and 200 words. If a paragraph is too short, then there's a chance that the content is not really that substantial in the first place, or that you are writing in more of a bullet point format rather than prose. If a paragraph is too long, then there's a risk of veering off the key point that the paragraph was originally meant to capture. Next, in order to write with clarity, you need to state your points explicitly, unambiguously, and definitively, so that the reader is left with no doubt about the points that you're trying to make. You can follow the age-old piece of advice, which is to tell your reader what you are going to say it, and then tell them what you said. Next, you want to ensure that your writing is simple. The principle of simplicity applies to various different aspects of writing, from your choice of words to your style of writing. Although academic writing is intended to be consumed by an audience that is educated, that does not mean that there is scope for using excessive jargon. technical terms must be clearly defined when it is necessary to use them. Insofar as it is possible, you should try to avoid using unnecessary jargon. In terms of style of writing, you should use plain language rather than flowery and descriptive language, which might be aesthetically pleasing in the context of a novel, but is distracting in a more academic context. Finally, clarity of writing is dependent on proper use of good spelling and grammar. Mistakes in spelling and grammar not only convey an overall deficit in quality, but they also lead to misinformation and misunderstanding. The writer must ensure that the reader does not become confused due to basic language errors. Fluency in the English language is therefore critical. The next thing is to ensure that when you are writing, you are doing so coherently. There are certain techniques that again we can try to use to maximize coherency, cohesion, and flow within our writing. Firstly, you can try to include focusing statements at key points in your written review. Focus statements are very important at the beginning of the review when you're outlining the scope of what you are going to be talking about, but subsequent to that, virtually every paragraph that you write should have a focus statement at the very beginning. The opening sentence in a paragraph should unambiguously point towards the key issue or point that is going to be made in a given paragraph, and it may also serve to link back to the bigger picture and let the reader know why the next point is relevant to the overarching topic or issue. For example, you might be talking about the concept of user experience and how this is a multi-dimensional construct with various different aspects such as desirability, usability, usefulness, etc. You might decide to devote a paragraph to highlighting that two of these dimensions, usability and usefulness, though they may sound similar, are actually quite distinct. To open this paragraph, you might say something along the lines of, in order to fully understand what user experience is, it is important to note the distinction between the dimensions of usability and usefulness. This sentence focuses your reader on the key point that you are trying to make in that paragraph, which relates to the distinction between two of the dimensions. Not only is this a good example of a focusing statement, but it is also a good example of what we call a linking statement. Linking statements are crucial in your writing because they establish connections between points and ideas, and that helps to ensure that there is a logical and smooth flow within your writing. Linking statements also help to establish good flow between different paragraphs. The linking aspect of the statement is the first few words in which you are linking back to both the bigger picture and what you have presumably been talking about in the previous paragraphs, i.e. the multidimensionality of the concept of user experience. Within a paragraph, you can also use linking phrases such as relatedly, expanding on this point, similar to, whereas, by comparison, and so on and so forth. These very simple additions can be the difference between a reader losing focus and getting lost, or remaining engaged and clear-minded. Similar to linking statements, we have something called transitioning statements. Many people would say that linking statements and transition statements are effectively the same, but I'm going to argue here that there is a slight distinction that can be made between these two based on the fact that linking is typically associated with connecting things, whereas transition is typically associated with moving to something new or changing something in some way. When writing your literature review, there will be times when you want to switch focus a bit, but you don't want to do this in a way that seems abrupt, or that makes different ideas in different paragraphs seem disconnected from one another. A strong transitional sentence can help you to move on to something new without affecting the continuity and flow of your writing. Transitional statements typically belong at the end of one paragraph, thereby leading into the next paragraph, or they can be placed at the beginning of a paragraph where they are used to flag and explain a switch in focus. For instance, at the end of one paragraph you might say something like, this highlights the need to consider, and then you mention the point that you will expand on in the next paragraph. Or you could say, of course, there are many other factors at play which should be considered, such as. At the beginning of a paragraph, if you want to switch focus in a way that is not abrupt, you could say something like, although usefulness and usability are important aspects of the user experience, desirability must also be considered. This sentence then paves the way for the switch in focus from one thing towards another. Finally, you should also consider using reinforcing statements, which may also be referred to as refocusing statements. This can remind your reader of the key point that you're trying to make, and remind them of the bigger picture and hammer home the takeaway message. For example, going back to the user experience topic, you might say, evidence clearly shows that usefulness and usability are both important but distinct aspects of user experience. Finally, when writing your literature review, it is important to write in a critical way. To do so, you can highlight differing viewpoints and refer to long-standing debates in the literature, or indeed, to new and emerging debates. Oftentimes in academic research, different authors present different ideas, and you may even notice differing schools of thought evolving simultaneously. Writing critically also means trying to highlight methodological limitations, confounds, and caveats that might affect the validity or reliability of research findings. Writing critically also means being alert to gaps in knowledge that may exist, where there are questions that have yet to be answered, or areas that have been under-researched, meaning that the weight of evidence does not clearly point in favour of any particular view. Lastly, another thing to consider when reviewing the literature critically is whether theoretical ideas and concepts have good scope for application in the real world. Perhaps they have been tested in settings that are quite artificial, as is often the case with basic research. Or perhaps they've been tested in certain real-world settings with some degree of success or some degree of failure. Or perhaps they simply haven't been tested widely enough in various different contexts to which you would hope those ideas could be applicable. That brings us to the end of Lesson 2.5, and indeed the end of Module 2, in which we focused on the literature review. There are certain things that we have only touched on briefly in these lessons, because resources may be available to you elsewhere. For instance, the library website is packed full of information, guidelines, and tutorials on searching library databases, using Boolean operators, and general academic writing skills. You can book individual and group sessions with the library staff to help you with specific areas, including writing a literature review for your research project. Moreover, DBS provides classes on academic writing, some of which may already be built into your timetable, such as the Writing for Graduate Studies class. Please make sure to check out the student handbook for a full breakdown of resources that are available to help you in developing and building your academic skills, and please do avail of all of the additional resources that are provided. Thanks for your attention throughout these lessons, and I hope they have helped to shed light on a really important aspect of carrying out research. See you next time for Module 3, when we will be looking at how to develop a problem statement and research question.